Okay, great. So my talk today examines an aspect of the lyric I that has been neglected in scholarship of lyric. What effects the first-person speaker of the lyric I has on the audience of early Greek monodic lyric, and how these effects are changed by textualization. In this talk, I will first provide a brief overview of scholarly approaches to the lyric I, before considering the effects of the first-person Deixis in Greek monodic lyric in performance and after textualization. Discussions of the lyric I are a staple in studies of lyric poetry. It is surprising then that approaches to the lyric I have been remarkably stable. In general, the priority has been identifying the lyric I, that is, answering the question who speaks. Two approaches have emerged, the biographical and the persona-based reading, the latter now being the dominant. Specifically, within classics, after the biographical approaches of the first half of the 20th century, it is now accepted that the first-person speaker in early Greek monody should be understood as being a distinct entity to the poet. Moreover, the concept of the so-called representative I, whether it is called this or not, has gained widespread acceptance. The representative I suggests that the speaker is representing the views of the broader group of the audience due to the particular historical context of lyric composition and performance in archaic Greece, where poetry is composed for a group. For example, an aristocratic hetairia, that is, a social and political male club, or the city more broadly. The idea is not dissimilar to how some medievalists see medieval European poets using the first person in a way that can be shared and used by the audience. In extreme formulations, however, the idea elides possibility of disagreement within the group. Such assumptions, even when not explicitly stated, are particularly common in discussions of poetry destined for the symposium, that is, the Greek drinking party, where everything the speaker says is theoretically supposed to reaffirm the group's identity and reinforce group cohesion. However, in my opinion, this position ignores the persuasive and argumentative aspects of many early Greek lyric poems. Today, I will move on from locating the lyric I on the scale between the biographical poet and the fictional speaker, and from appealing to the representative I to discuss the relationship between poet, speaker, and audience, in order to complicate the boundaries between them. The effect of the lyric I that has most fascinated scholars has been the so-called eavesdropping effect. This is almost the defining element of lyric in modern theories, since at least John Stuart Mill's famous declaration in What is Poetry, that eloquence is heard, poetry is overheard, and later Northrop Frye's formulation that lyric is preeminently the utterance that is overheard. Even amongst scholars who reject Mill's opposition of rhetoric and lyric, such as Jonathan Culler and Mutlu Blasing, the importance of eavesdropping in theories persist. So Culler has argued for the centrality of triangulation between the speaker, the addressee, and the reader in lyric. While most classicists, since the performative turn in the 80s, when social pragmatics became the dominant approach, have not focused on eavesdropping, they too have been negotiating the effects of the I-U relationship created by the lyric I. Scholars such as Wolfgang Rösler and Bruno Gentili skirted around the issue though, as in their view the lyric poetry we have was never supposed to pass beyond the poets' groups, so there is no overhearing. And since everyone at the symposium were members of the poets' groups, it hardly counted as overhearing if, as often, the lyric I addressed a single person by name, who presumably was present at the symposium. The more recent, wider consideration of reperformance has not provided more satisfactory approaches, as scholars have been much more interested in the physical and social contexts, the who, how, and why of reperformance, than in the literary effects. And when literary aspects have been considered, attention has not always been on the identity of the lyric I. And this is where I want to begin my talk today in earnest. Many elements of a lyric poem help to make the poem reperformable and have similar effects in secondary performances, from deictics to descriptions. So in the first surviving stanza of Alcaeus fragment 129, Tode o Delon Temenos Mega, this great conspicuous precinct here, uses both the demonstrative tode, this here, to mark place and time, and description through the noun and adjectives to establish a setting. Together, elements like these, deictics in a broad sense, or world-building elements, contribute to create possible worlds. We should note that many such world-building elements are just as hard at work in original performances as they are in secondary performances. Thus, in Alcia's fragment 208, since it seems unlikely for the poem to have been performed on a ship during an actual storm, the physicality of the metaphorical setting is established through the world-building elements. For example, the many nouns and adjectives like Tom and Kuma, one wave and another wave, Nai Melanai, black ship, Antlos, Bilgewater, and so on and so forth. And directional adverb like enthen, from this side, from that side, and location markers like Tom Messon in the middle, and time marked in the present tense verbs. What is less often discussed as a deictic is the first person speaker. The first person is different from other deictics and speakers in not requiring demonstration, and along with the second person, has no object reference, but is identified only with reference to the instance of discourse. So, according to Bonveniste, I cannot be defined except in terms of locution, not in terms of objects as a nominal sign is. I signifies the person who is uttering the present instance of the discourse containing I. Something strange, however, happens with literary performance. Whereas linguistically, the referent of I shifts according to the physical performing speaker, the referent of I remains the composed, performed speaker in performance. That is, others usurp the lyric speaker's I, necessarily even in primary performance with a lyric speaker not completely overlapping with the biographical poet. That means that functionally and performatively, the performer takes on the identity of the poem's speaker. This impersonation is of a different order to other uses of the first person in lyric. Unlike with reported speech and quotations, no surrounding linguistic context signals the words are not those of the speaker. So in Alcia's fragment 360, there is no sense that the speaker becomes Aristodemus during the quotation, but the situation makes clear it is brought in as evidence to support the speaker's argument, not to replace him. In Sappho fragment 94, the speech of the interlocutor is marked out by eipemoi, she said to me. Given the epic style speech introduction formula, tan dego ta dame baman, I replied to her thus, I would not be surprised if the other woman's speech began with another epic style speech formulation formula in the lost part of the poem, if the first surviving line, Tetnakan dadalo stelo, honestly I wish I were dead, are words of the interlocutor rather than the speaker. Here there may be impersonation, but it is really mediated through the perspective of the lyric I, who butts in with context like me psistomina katalimpanen, pollakai tod eipemoi. She was leaving me with many tears and said this. In Sappho fragment 1, it seems fair to assume that no performer or audience member will identify the performer as Aphrodite when her words are quoted directly, but rather recognize the poet taking on the identity of the speaker, called Sappho by Aphrodite, who herself is impersonating Aphrodite because of the context of the lead-up, where Aphrodite's words had been told in reported speech. In contrast, the lyric I is not embedded in such linguistic or literary contexts. There are, of course, performative contexts, and much more to say about these two fragments of Sappho, but these will have to wait for another time. We can compare the re-performer taking on the identity of the poem's speaker with actors taking on the identity of characters. Scholars such as Ismini Lada Richards have investigated the subjectivity of Attic drama, noting how successful ancient Greek actors had the ability to project themselves into the position of the characters portrayed while maintaining their own identities. Dicaeopolis in Aristophanes' Acharnians 440-1 serves as an example when, with the costume and props of Euripides' character Telephus, he says, "For I must seem to be a beggar today, must be who I am, but not appear so." This sentence cuts to the heart of the matter. The reperformer remains the reperformer, but also appears to the reperformer and the audience to be the character performed. Beyond dramatic actors, a similar idea appears to lie behind the discussion in Plato's Ion, where Ion the rhapsode agrees with Socrates that he feels the emotions of the poetry he recites. Modern dramatic theory and cognitive perspectives on actors' empathy with characters too recognize a similar tendency. So much seems pretty intuitive. An unexpected corollary is that a reperformer has always already been an audience of the poem they reperform, and so there is a further collapse in identity between speaker, performer, and audience. That is, if a Greek lyric poet composes for their poetry to be reperformed, the identity of the lyric I is adopted not only by the initial performer, but also by the audience reperformer, which is necessary for reperformance. There is slippage between audience and reperformer, since the learning and repeating of knowledge through songs is the core of early Greek education. The audience is, of course, also in the position of the addressee or bystander as well, but in the context of early Greek lyric production and performance, the audience is potentially always a reperformer. A play on such potentiality is captured in an anecdote in Aeolian, where Solon, who is roughly contemporary with Sappho, heard his nephew sing a song of Sappho and asked him to teach it to him so that he may learn it and die. So all this could appear like another manifestation of the representative I. But the point of the representative I is that the speaker is giving voice to the views of the group. Meanwhile, my point is that the poet can control the views of the audience through the lyric I, and has more control than is widely thought. Here, we should make a distinction between the strong, character-focused lyric I and the speaker role-focused lyric I. Examples of the character-focused type include the political fragments of Alcaeus and Solon, who both cultivate strong, identifiable characters with characters' own biographies, attitudes, and perspectives maintained across several poems. So, Alcaeus retells the story of receiving 2,000 staters from the Lydians, and probably his brother's exploits with the Babylonians, in at least 2 surviving fragments each. Similarly, he tells and presumably retells in detail from his perspective in fragment 129 how he was betrayed by his former political ally Pittacus, who he characterizes as well consistently across several fragments as a clever, scheming, and greedy fellow. Solon, too, narrates his reasoning behind the legal reforms in Athens across several fragments and consistently presents himself as a man seeking the middle path and a man knowing the allures of, but not aspiring to, tyranny. Both Alcaeus' and Solon's political fragments have the first-person speaker who is probably quite close to and draws significantly on the poet's biography. But this does not seem to be a prerequisite for character-focused lyric I. The speaker of the early 7th century Archilochus cannot, for example, always be identified closely with the biographical poet, but is still full of recognizable personality. A role-focused type can be found in much of the Theogonidaea, a collection of elegies attributed to Theognis, but containing extracts from an unknown number of poets. Other examples include the fragments of Alcaeus without contemporary references and the wedding poems of Sappho. These fragments have a lyric I that lack consistent or developed personality, but who primarily aim to produce a paradigmatic figure for a role. So, in the Theogonidaea, the name Theognis is found only once in the entire collection, and very little biographical detail is given throughout the collection. The primary purpose of the lyric I in the Theogonidaea is the easy adoption of the speaker's role as the wise, somewhat life-weary aristocratic symposiast guiding a young man. As we can see from Theogonidaea 183-92 and 197-208, This is largely achieved through the use of imperatives and many aphorisms, which are often undercut or problematized to point out the difficulty of knowing the truth that only he and other wise, good, aristocratic men like him can teach. The scraps of Sappho's ritual approximate wedding songs appear to support the expectation that the first-person speaker in them is not a fleshed-out figure, but a role to be adopted by the performer, as we can see at Sappho fragments 112-6. The purpose and workings of the two types of lyric I seem to differ. The character-focused lyric I found in Alcaeus and Solon aims to persuade or explain complicated decisions, as, for example, we find in Solon fragment 34. In such poems, the argument is bound up with the specific identity of the lyric speaker. That is, the I, when reperformed, only makes sense when the reperformer is identified by the audience as the speaker Alcaeus or Solon, and not as the reperformer. This is a way, then, for the poet-speaker to be in places the poet is not, and persuade those he or she cannot reach in space or time. The effect on the perennially forgotten performer, too, is noteworthy. They become the speaker performatively and cognitively, having been enticed to learn the poem, commit it to memory, and embody the poet-speaker. Thus, the persuasiveness of character-focused lyric I is extended across time and space through the collapse of the identities of the speaker, audience, and reperformer. Archilochus's lyric I, too, can be seen this way, with apportioning and explaining blame as the equivalent of Alcaeus's and Solon's persuasion and explanation. Cognitive research suggests that complete identification, as opposed to other types of psychological projection, can be achieved when the audience recognizes aspects of their own personalities in the literary work. The highly specific biographical details here may hinder this process, so the degree of identification with these strong characters may depend on the attitudes of individuals. But the payoff for the poet is great when it can be achieved. In contrast, the role-focused lyric I has few problems with projection. It makes it as easy as possible for the audience and reperformer to adopt the I, because its purpose is not to persuade, but to hand on and propagate a stable and recognized role. Very few things in ritual wedding songs could require explanation, and the speaker of the elegies in the Theognodia may sometimes explain a few things, but the rhetoric suggests that the things the speaker says are supposed to be self-evident truth, while the lack of overtly persuasive rhetoric adds to the air of experience and authority of the speaker. But adoption might not actually be the best word. The identity of the speaker is nondescript and is subsumed to a large extent to that of the reperformer. The answer then to who speaks is quite complex, and the representative I seems inadequate. To oversimplify, the overt identity of the role-focused speaker is that of the performer, while the identity of the character-focused speaker is that of the character. We come now to the question, does anything change if the performance aspect of early Greek lyric is altered? Of course, music is lost, but its effects are not the topic today. The changes of dynamic from where the poet's words are mediated through a performer to where the poet's words appear visually on the page, and from where the audience is expected to reperform the performed poem to where the audience's participation usually stops at reading, are significant. Both changes lead to a more direct link between poet or speaker and the audience or reader, as it cuts away the mediator of the performer, and the multi-directional webbed relationship of the identities of poet, speaker, performer, and audience become a unidirectional linear relationship of poet imparting information to the reader through the speaker. The relationship, as early Greek lyric is textualized, appears to become one of authorship rather than identity of the speakers of individual poems. the role-focused lyric I progressively loses its purpose of being re-performed by the audience, though not straight away, since textualization did not immediately replace oral performance. However, with weak or unsustained characterization of the speaker, when the poems were put into collections, the identities of the poet and speaker were lost and came to be attributed to poets whose works named them. That is the story of the Theognodia, where the entire collection came to be attributed to Theognis. And indeed, Theognis appears to have foreseen some of the problems. In Theognodia 19-38, Theognis says, "Sphregis epikeste tois lepison," let a seal be placed on these verses. He anticipates misappropriation of his verses. Unfortunately, what the seal is exactly is fiercely debated, with the most popular being the name Cernus, the name Theognis, the style, the ethico-political content, and even a physical seal. I personally suspect that the phrase, "nor will anyone take something worse in exchange, when that which is good is at hand," suggests that this self-evident truth in his verses will mean it won't be confused with others that lack it. It is the lack of specificity of his speaker's self-characterization that makes his verses stealable in the first place. And indeed, the ease of reperformance and adoption of the role is a cultivated characteristic of Theognis' speaker. What Theognis appears to object to is his poetry being taken by men who are not wise like he is, Sophis Dominoi in line 1. He is not concerned with those who are not eslos or agathos, noble and good. To supposedly good men, the quality and truth of these verses will be obvious and useful. But just as Cernus may lose even the sense he has if he is in the company of so-called bad men, so too the quality and truth of his verses will be obscure and lost without the performance context of good men. Consequently, only the good and noble have use for his poetry, so they will say at symposia, "These are the verses of Theognis of Megara, and he is famous among all men." The bad have no use and context for Theognis. In this light, the correct naming of Theognis as author is secondary to the continued use and adoption of his verses. Still, the question of authorship is exacerbated by textualization, whereas previously it did not matter in the same way. However, the character-focused lyric I largely maintains its control. The dependency of the lyric speaker in Alcaeus's political fragments and in some of Solon's fragments on the poet's biographies means the lens of authorship rather favored works like theirs and even attracted other weaker lyric speakers to them. There are justifiable recent concerns over the authorship of many fragments attributed to Solon, and I cannot see how we can be sure of the Alcaean authorship of the fragments attributed to him, but without contemporary references. Although modern scholars love to laugh at ancient grammarians for treating the words of early Greek lyric poets as historical truth, in fact, the sheer universality of identifying the speaker with poet testifies to the success of a character-focused I at collapsing the identities of the poet and speaker, and to the hardening of the I-you relationship. Furthermore, with collections, there is a further pull, since poems can now be read together and biographies constructed, as indeed they were already in the 5th century, with Herodotus our earliest surviving testament for this. And arguably, this was the feature. Authorial self-characterization becomes increasingly important in Greek literature, and when we see Roman lyric in full swing with Catullus, the poetic persona cultivated across poetic books seems firmly established. We have explored the under-examined aspects of the lyric I, the performative effects of the deixis of the lyric I, and how that is affected by textualization. In approaches to lyric, the identification of the lyric I has been a matter of distance between the poet and the speaker, but I've sought today to show how thinking about the first-person deixis can lead us to observe the collapse of identities of the poet, speaker, performer, and audience. Broadly, two different uses of this collapse were identified, the character-focused and the role-focused, and I suggested that this distinction was at least partially responsible for the different fates of the identities of the lyric I, with a focus on authorship that attended textualization. Thank you.